church hadn't held a service in 11 years when I bought it. And I want to be clear about that because it matters. I wasn't desecrating anything. I wasn't tearing apart some living congregation's sacred ground. The building was a foreclosure, listed on a county auction site between a flooded duplex in Hinton and a half-acre lot outside Lewisburg that turned out to be vertical cliff face someone had surveyed wrong. I found it the way you find most things when you're 36 and your marriage has just ended and you've cashed out your half of a duplex in Roanoke for less than you owed on it. I was looking for something I could afford that had walls and a roof and enough square footage to feel like I hadn't lost everything. The listing said, former commercial property, limestone block construction, 2,400 square feet, unimproved lot, estate sale sold as is. It did not say church. The photos were deliberately cropped to exclude the steeple, which I suspect is because the realtor knew that churches don't sell. People don't want to live in them. There's a psychological weight to it, something about the dimensions of the space, the height of the ceilings, the way the windows are shaped. It feels like you're occupying a room designed to hold a feeling you're not currently having. But I drove down from Roanoke on a Thursday in October and walked through it and saw what it actually was, which was cheap, solid, fixable, and mine if I wanted it for $31,000. The building sat on Twist Run Road, about 4 miles southeast of a town called Durbin, in Pocahontas County, in eastern West Virginia. Pocahontas County has roughly 8,000 people spread across 900 square miles. The church sat in a hollow between two ridges, surrounded by white oak and tulip poplar, with a gravel pull-off that served as a parking lot and a single-lane bridge over a creek that ran brown after rain. The nearest neighbor was a cattle operation about 1.5 miles north. The nearest grocery store was 22 miles. I want you to understand the geography because the geography is the point. I wasn't in the middle of nowhere. I was in the kind of nowhere that has a shape to it, a drainage pattern, a way that water and sound and light move through the landscape that becomes the architecture of your days. When I moved in, November, after closing, I learned that sound carried differently in the hollow. A truck on Route 250 3 miles east would arrive as a low hum that built for 45 seconds before Doppler shifting away. Rain started on the South Ridge first, always, and I could hear it coming through the canopy, like someone dragging a blanket across the treetops. At night, the creek was the only sound. Some nights it was the only proof that time was moving at all. I'm a cabinet maker, am. I build custom kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, built-in bookshelves. I had a shop in Roanoke that I lost in the divorce because it was attached to the house and the house was in her name. The church gave me space. The sanctuary. I kept calling it that even though I'd pulled the pews out within the first week, was 30 feet by 60 with 18-foot ceilings and those tall, narrow windows that let in bars of light that moved across the floor like slow clock hands. I set up my table saw, my planer, my workbenches, my dust collection system. The altar platform became my finishing area. I slept in what had been the pastor's study, a 12 by 14 room off the back with its own wood stove and a window that faced the ridge. The first 3 months were the best I'd felt in years, and I'm not saying that to set up a contrast. I mean it. I was alone, I was working, I was eating simple food and sleeping hard and waking up to frost on the windows and the sound of the creek. I drove to Elkins once a week for supplies and materials. I had a client who sent me steady work, bathroom vanities mostly, for a development his company was building. I'd build them in the sanctuary, load them into the truck, and drive them over the mountain. It was a life. It was my life. The silence didn't bother me because I'd spent the last 3 years of my marriage in a different kind of silence, the kind that has another person in it, and this was better. The basement is where I need to start, and I know that's where you expected me to go, but I need you to understand that I didn't go looking for anything. The church had a basement. I knew that from the listing. It was accessed through a door in the floor behind, where the altar had been, a heavy oak hatch with iron hinges that had been painted over so many times the hinges were just lumps. The listing described it as partial basement, stone foundation, unfinished, approximately 600 square feet. I opened it the first week, looked down a set of stone steps into darkness, smelled that cold mineral smell that old basements have, and decided I'd deal with it later. Later turned out to be February, because that's when the pipe froze. The church's water came from a well, and the pressure tank and the filtration system were in the basement. I'd been lazy about it. I'd winterized the exposed pipes in the crawl space on the north side, but I hadn't gone down to check the basement lines, because going down there meant moving my finishing station, pulling up the hatch, and carrying a light source, because there was no electrical run below the main floor. The building had been wired in the 1960s, and whoever did it simply hadn't bothered with the basement. So when I woke up on a morning in February to no water pressure and the thermometer outside reading 9 degrees, I knew where I was going. I pulled the hatch. I took a work light on an extension cord. The steps were limestone block, same as the walls, hand-cut and uneven. And they went down about 9 feet to a poured concrete floor that I could tell had been added much later than the original construction. The basement was exactly what you'd expect. Stone walls, low ceiling, that metallic damp smell, the pressure tank humming in the corner, PVC lines running along the ceiling joists. I found the frozen section, wrapped it, thawed it with a hairdryer, and had water again within an hour. Standard homeowner problem, standard fix. But while I was down there, waiting for the pipe to thaw, I looked around. The basement was not 600 square feet. It was maybe 400, which meant either the listing was wrong or the footprint didn't match the building above. I didn't think much of it at the time. Listings are wrong about everything. But I noticed that the south wall, the wall that would have been directly beneath the sanctuary's main entrance, was different from the others. The east, west, and north walls were limestone block, hand-cut, mortared, consistent with the 1920s construction date on the deed. The south wall was concrete, poured concrete, maybe 8 inches thick, with a rough surface that looked like it had been done without proper formwork. It bowed slightly inward at the center, which I initially attributed to soil pressure. But the bow was too uniform, too deliberate. It looked less like a wall that had been pushed and more like a wall that had been built to follow a curve that was already there. I put my hand on it while I was waiting for the pipe. It was cold, which was expected, but it was colder than the stone walls by a meaningful margin. Not damp cold, not winter ground cold. It felt like the cold was coming through it, like there was moving air on the other side, which in February, in West Virginia, would mean an opening to the outside, which would mean the south foundation was breached, which would mean I had a much bigger problem than a frozen pipe. I finished with the pipe. I went back upstairs. I put the hatch back down and moved my finishing station over it and didn't think about the wall for almost 2 weeks. What brought me back was the sound. It started in late February during a warm snap. Temperatures went from single digits to to the mid-50s over 3 days, the kind of swing that happens in the Allegheny Highlands and makes the forest sound like it's digesting itself. Ice cracking off branches, snow melt gurgling through every seam in the ground, the creek rising to a roar you could feel through the floor. During this thaw, at night, lying in the pastor's study with the wood stove ticking, I heard something I hadn't heard before, a low, rhythmic exhalation. Not wind. Wind has variation randomness, the chaos of turbulence. This was steady. A slow pulse, maybe 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, like the building was breathing through a hole I couldn't see. I got up the first night and walked the sanctuary with a flashlight. I checked the windows. I checked the front doors, which I'd weather stripped in November. I checked the back door. I stood still and listened, and the sound was gone. I went back to bed, and it came back within 20 minutes, at exactly the point where I'd stopped consciously listening for it. The second night, I realized it was coming from the floor. The third night, I moved the finishing station, opened the hatch, and went down with my work light and a flashlight, and stood in the basement in my socks and sweatpants at 2 a.m. and put my ear against the concrete south wall. The sound was on the other side, clear and unmistakable, a rhythmic displacement of air, massive and slow, like something breathing through a passage that was very large and very deep. I could feel it against my cheek. Not warmth. The air was cold, but movement, pressure and release, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. I stood there for probably 15 minutes. Then I went back upstairs, closed the hatch, and sat at my workbench until dawn. I want to tell you I called someone. I want to tell you I drove to Durbin and asked around, or called the county assessor's office, or looked up the property history, or did any of the things a careful person would do. What I actually did was start knocking on the wall with a framing hammer during my lunch breaks. I told myself I was checking for voids, which was true. The concrete rang solid for the first 3 feet on either side, and from the floor to about 4 feet up. Above 4 feet and toward the center, the sound changed. Hollower, thinner. I marked the area with chalk. It was roughly 3 feet wide and extended from about 4 feet off the floor to the ceiling joists. The shape was vertical and slightly tapered, wider at the top than the bottom, like a doorway that someone had filled in and then built a wall over. On a Saturday in early March, I drilled a test hole, 1/4-inch masonry bit, 18 inches long. The drill punched through 8 inches of concrete, and then the resistance dropped to nothing, and the bit spun free, and I felt air pull through the hole. Not push, pull, a gentle suction that drew a thin whistle from the 1/4-inch gap. I put my eye to it and saw nothing. I put my nose to it and smelled limestone and water and something else, something organic that I couldn't name, not decay exactly. More like the smell of a creek stone turned over in summer. That mineral alive scent of water that has been touching biology in the dark for a long time. I am not a reckless person. I want that understood. I am methodical. I measure twice. I plan my cuts. I had been through a divorce that taught me what it costs when you act on impulse. And I had rebuilt my life on the principle of careful, sequential work. One board at a time, one joint at a time. But I drilled that hole on a Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon I had rented a rotary hammer from the hardware store in Elkins and driven it back to the church, and by Saturday evening I had opened a hole in the concrete wall, 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, starting at 4 feet off the floor, which meant I was looking at it like a window. Behind the concrete was the original limestone wall, or what was left of it. Someone had removed a section of the stone blocks. Carefully, you could see the chisel marks where the mortar had been cut, creating an opening about 2.5 feet wide and maybe 5 feet tall. A doorway. Through it was not soil. Through it was not foundation rubble or packed earth or the clay substratum that should have been on the other side of a basement wall built into a hillside. Through it was open space, moving air, and the sound suddenly loud without the concrete to muffle it, that slow rhythmic breathing of a passage much larger than anything that should exist beneath a small wooden church in a West Virginia hollow. I got my best flashlight, 400 lumens. I aimed it through the opening and the beam went out and didn't hit anything for as far as I could track it, which was maybe 40 or 50 feet before the light diffused into general glow against what appeared to be a natural limestone ceiling, about 12 feet above a natural limestone floor. The passage, because that's what it was, a passage, not a room, extended south from the opening and curved gently to the east. The floor was smooth and damp. The walls were sculpted by water in that flowing organic way that cast limestone gets when it's been dissolving for tens of thousands of years. There were no tool marks, no construction, no human shaping at all except the opening itself, which had clearly been cut through the church's foundation to connect the basement to what was already there. I did not go in that night. I closed the hole with a piece of plywood, screwed it to the concrete with tapcons, went upstairs and sat in the sanctuary in the dark and listened to the building breathe. The next morning, I called the Pocahontas County Assessor's office. I told the woman who answered that I'd bought the church on Twist Run Road and was doing renovation work and had some questions about the property history. She was helpful. She pulled the records. The church had been built in 1924 by a congregation called the Twist Run Brethren, which she said had been a small independent fellowship, not affiliated with any major denomination. The building had been used continuously as a church until 2013, when the last 3 members, all elderly, all since deceased, had stopped holding services. It had gone to the county through tax default in 2019 and sat empty until I bought it. I asked if there were any records of the basement, any permits for modification, any mention of geological features on the property. She said the only permits on file were an electrical permit from 1964 and a well permit from 1978. No basement permits, no geological surveys. I asked who had poured the concrete wall in the basement. She said she had no way of knowing that. I asked if the Twist Run Brethren had any surviving records, any archives, anything. She gave me the number for the Pocahontas County Historical Society, which was a woman named Darlene Frey, who operated out of her house in Marlinton. I called Darlene Frey. She was 81 years old, and she knew exactly what I was talking about before I finished my first sentence. "You're in the Twist Run Church," she said. "You found the basement." "I found what's behind the basement," I said. There was a pause, not a dramatic pause. A thinking pause, the kind of silence that comes from someone deciding how much to say. "The congregation knew about it from the beginning," she said. "They built there because of it. My mother's aunt was a member. Not a founding member. She joined in the 30s, but she talked about it before she died. They called it the craw, like a bird's craw, the crop, where things go before they're digested. That's what they called the cave. They said the mountain had a craw, and they were sitting on top of it. I asked her what they did with it, what it was for. They went in," she said. "Not all of them, a few. The ones who were chosen or who volunteered, I don't know which. They went in and they came back and they didn't talk about it. My aunt said the ones who went in were different after. Not wrong, not sick. She said they were heavier. She used that word specifically. She said Virgil Kessler went in on a Saturday evening and came back Sunday morning. And after that, when he walked into a room, you could feel him before you saw him, like he was taking up more space than his body. She said it wasn't frightening. She said it was the opposite. She said people wanted to be near him. She said sitting next to Virgil Kessler in church after he'd been down was like sitting next to a wood stove. You could feel it coming off him. I asked what it was. She didn't say. She said you could feel it, and that was enough. She said the whole congregation could feel it. And that was why they kept the church going for almost 90 years, even when there were only a handful of them left. She said the cave gave them something, and they maintained the church as a way of, I don't know how to put this, keeping the opening respectful. Kept, maintained. She said they sealed it in the 80s because the ones who went in were getting older, and there was no one coming up who they trusted to go. Trusted to go or trusted to come back, I said. Darlene Free laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh. I asked my aunt the same thing, she said. She didn't answer me either. I thanked her. I hung up. I drove to Elkins and bought a proper headlamp, 100 feet of paracord, a handheld GPS unit that I knew wouldn't get satellite signal underground, but that had an electronic compass and a pedometer function, and a pack of sidewalk chalk. I also bought a hard hat, which I'd never worn in my life, because the ceiling of a limestone cave is not a place to learn lessons about head injuries. I went in on a Wednesday. I don't know why I remember that. March 12th. A Wednesday. Overcast. 38 degrees outside. I told no one where I was going because there was no one to tell. My ex-wife and I hadn't spoken in 4 months. My mother was in assisted living in Lynchburg and didn't always know who I was on the phone. My sister lived in Portland and we exchanged texts on holidays. I had no friends in Pocahontas County. I had a client in Staunton who expected a delivery on Friday. If I disappeared into a cave on Wednesday and didn't come out, the first person who would notice would be a general contractor in Staunton on Friday afternoon, and he would notice because his vanities were late, not because I was missing. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the weight of walking through that opening alone. Not the fear, the loneliness of it. The knowledge that the space between me and the next person who would think my name was measured in days, not hours, and that the distance was not an accident, but the accumulated result of every choice I'd made for 36 years. I had arranged my life so that I could disappear into the earth on a Wednesday morning, and the earth would have me for 2 full days before anyone asked a question. That is not horror, that is biography. The cave didn't create that fact, it just made me stand inside it. The passage ran south-southeast from the opening for approximately 210 feet, according to the pedometer. The ceiling varied from 8 feet to 14 feet. The floor was wet limestone, smooth in some places, broken into rubble fields in others, where sections of ceiling had fallen at some point in the geological past. The walls were scalloped and fluted by water action, and in several places I could see the remnants of flowstone and small stalactites that had been broken off. Not recently. The breaks were old, weathered, coated in the same mineral film as the surrounding stone, but they'd been broken by hand. Someone, at some point, had walked through this passage and cleared the formations that hung low enough to obstruct movement. At 210 feet, the passage opened into a chamber. I need to describe this carefully because the chamber is where the story changes, and I don't want you to think I'm embellishing. I am a cabinet maker. I think in measurements. I think in materials and tolerances and the specific properties of specific substances. What I'm going to tell you is what I observed in the order I observed it, with the precision I'm capable of. The chamber was roughly oval, maybe 60 feet long on the major axis, 40 feet on the minor axis. The ceiling was high, 25 feet, maybe 30. The floor was flat and dry, which was strange given how wet the passage had been, and the walls were covered in handprints, not painted, not drawn, pressed into the limestone as if the stone had been soft when the hands touched it and then hardened around the impression. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They covered the walls from about 3 feet off the floor to about 8 feet up, which is the range a standing person could reach. They were all sizes, adult hands, some very large, some small, and they were layered, newer prints pressed over older ones, generations of hands pushing into the same stone, so that in places the wall looked like a coral reef of fingers and palms, a topography of human touch compressed into geological time. I stood in the center of that chamber and turned in a slow circle with my headlamp on and watched the shadows of 1,000 fingers shift as the light moved across them. And I felt something I did not expect to feel. I felt welcomed, not in a supernatural sense, not a voice, not a presence, not a warmth. I am being precise. I felt the way you feel when you walk into a room where people have been gathering for a long time. There's a residual social weight to it, a sense that the space has been shaped by use, that human bodies have been here so often and for so long that the room itself has learned what humans feel like and is accommodating them. The chamber felt like that. It felt like a room that expected people, that was waiting for them in the way a table set for dinner waits, not sentient, not alive, but arranged. The breathing sound was louder here, not coming from the chamber itself, but from beyond it, from the far end, where the oval narrowed into another passage that continued deeper. The air moved through the chamber in that same slow rhythm, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Standing in the center of the room, I could feel it against every exposed surface of my skin simultaneously, a gentle, even pulsation that seemed to come from all directions because the chamber was acting as a resonating body, spreading the airflow across its entire volume. I did not go deeper that first time. I went back to the basement. I screwed the plywood back over the hole. I went upstairs and made coffee and sat at my workbench and tried to work and couldn't, not because I was frightened, but because my hands were shaking with something that was closer to exhilaration, and exhilaration is not a safe feeling for a table saw. I went back the next day, and the day after, and every day for the next 2 weeks. Each time I went a little further, past the handprint chamber. I started calling it the vestibule, because that's what it felt like, an entry hall. The passage continued south-southeast and began to descend, not steeply, maybe a 5-degree grade. The character of the stone changed. The water-sculpted scallops gave way to smoother surfaces, and the limestone began to show color. Bands of iron red and manganese black that striped the walls in undulating layers. The passage narrowed in places to 4 feet wide and opened in others to 15 or 20. There were side passages, some of which I marked with chalk and explored for short distances. Most dead-ended within 50 or 100 feet. One, on my 4th trip, opened into a smaller chamber that contained something I spent 3 days thinking about before I went back to look at it again. It was a chair, a wooden chair, plain, straight-backed, with a woven seat that had long since rotted away, leaving only the frame. It sat in the center of the small chamber on the bare stone floor. There was nothing else in the room. No table, no lamp, no other furniture, just a chair facing the back wall, as if someone had carried it 200 yards into the earth to sit and look at stone. The chair was old. The wood was grey and checked and had the brittleness of extreme age. I didn't touch it, but I looked at it for a long time, and I thought about who had carried it in and why, and what they had sat there looking at, and the only answer that made sense was that they had sat there looking at nothing, which meant they had sat there to feel something, which meant the cave offered a feeling, and the chair was evidence that someone had wanted to stay in that feeling long enough to need to sit down. I thought about what Darlene Frey's aunt had said about Virgil Kessler. Heavier, taking up more space than his body, like a wood stove, something you could feel coming off him. On my 7th trip, I reached a point approximately 600 feet from the basement opening. The pedometer was increasingly unreliable, on uneven ground, but that's my best estimate, where the passage widened into a space I couldn't fully illuminate. My headlamp was 400 lumens, rated for 200 feet of throw, and the beam faded into darkness without finding a far wall. The floor here was different. It was polished, not by water, by feet. Thousands of feet over thousands of years had worn the limestone to a glassy smoothness that reflected my headlamp back at me like a dark mirror. I could see my own face in the floor, distorted and elongated, looking up at me from under the mountain. The breathing was strong here, not sound anymore, sensation. The air pressure rose and fell with enough force that I could feel it in my inner ears, a gentle rhythmic compression that was almost exactly the same rate as a resting human heartbeat if you stretched each beat to 8 seconds, 4 seconds of pressure, 4 seconds of release. My own breathing started matching it involuntarily. I noticed this only when I tried to speak. I'd been narrating my observations out loud, a habit from working alone, and found that my words came only on the exhale cycle of the cave, as if the cave's rhythm had overwritten my own. I sat down on the polished floor. I turned off my headlamp. The dark was total. Not the dark of a room with the lights off, where your eyes adjust and shapes emerge. The dark of a place where photons have never arrived. My visual cortex, starved for input, began generating its own. Dim, floating phosphenes, blue and green and gold, that moved when I moved my eyes and faded when I tried to focus on them. This is normal. This is a known phenomenon. Cave dark will do this to anyone within minutes. What was not normal was the warmth. The cave had been cool throughout, 54 degrees roughly, which is standard for caves in this region, at this depth. But sitting on the polished floor in the dark, I became aware of warmth rising through the stone. Not geothermal warmth, not the generalized heat of deep earth. This was localized. It came from directly below me, from the stone my body was touching, and it increased over the 20 minutes I sat there, until it felt exactly like what Darlene Frey's aunt had described. A wood stove, a body temperature warmth that was not my own heat reflecting back, but something radiating upward from further down, as if there were a source of biological warmth beneath the floor. Something alive and very close to the surface of the stone. I sat in that warmth in the dark for an hour, I know, because I checked my watch when I sat down and when I stood up. I didn't intend to stay that long. It didn't feel that long. The time compressed the way it does when you're in a state of deep comfort. Like falling asleep, like being held, like the moment after. You've been cold for a long time and finally get warm, and your muscles release, and your breathing slows, and the boundary between you and the thing warming you becomes blurred and permeable and unimportant. When I turned my headlamp back on and stood up, I felt heavier, not in a metaphorical sense. I mean, my boots felt more firmly planted. My arms hung with more weight. When I walked, my footfalls sounded different, more solid, more present, as if my body had gained density without gaining mass. I walked the 600 feet back to the basement opening and climbed through and went upstairs and stood in the sanctuary, and the sanctuary felt different, thinner, less substantial, like the air was too light and the light was too thin, and the wooden floor was a membrane over a depth I could now feel in a way I hadn't felt before. I drove to Elkins the next day for supplies, and the woman at the hardware store, I'd been in there a dozen times. She knew my face, looked at me longer than usual, not staring, just looking. The way you look at someone when something about them has changed, and you're trying to locate what it is. She didn't say anything. She rang up my order and handed me my receipt, and her hand brushed mine during the exchange, and she pulled it back fast. Not a flinch, a startle, the kind of involuntary withdrawal you make when you touch something unexpectedly warm. "You okay?" I said. "You're really warm," she said, and then she laughed it off, and I laughed it off, and I drove back to the church with my sizes. And I didn't go into the cave that day. I went the next day instead, and the day after, and it became what my mornings became. Coffee, work for a few hours, then the basement, then the cave, then the polished chamber where I'd sit in the dark and feel the warmth come up through the floor and lose time in a way that felt like finding it. I stopped counting the trips. I stopped marking the walls with chalk. I stopped bringing the GPS. I knew the way. The cave knew I knew the way. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but I mean it literally. The cave felt different when I was in it. Warmer, quieter, the breathing slower, as if it was adjusting to my presence the way a room adjusts when someone familiar enters it. The chair in the side chamber, which I'd avoided touching, I moved on my 12th or 15th trip. I carried it to the polished chamber and sat in it instead of on the floor, and sitting in that chair, in that dark, in that warmth, was the closest thing to peace I had ever felt in my adult life. I want you to understand that I knew this was wrong, not structurally wrong. I could feel myself being changed by a process I didn't understand, and I was allowing it because the change felt better than what I was before the change. That's the logic of every bad decision I've ever made, including the marriage, including the divorce, including the move to West Virginia. The feeling is good, so the thing must be good. I knew better. I knew better, and I kept going back. By the end of March, I'd lost the Staunton client, not dramatically. I just stopped delivering on time. The vanities sat half-finished in the sanctuary while I spent my mornings underground. He called. I apologized. He called again. I apologized again. And then he stopped calling, and I felt nothing about it except relief that I didn't have to pretend I cared about bathroom vanities when there was something beneath me that made bathroom vanities feel like a language I no longer spoke. In early April, I went deeper than the polished chamber for the first time. The passage continued beyond it, narrowing again, descending more steeply. The walls here were wet, almost oily, and the limestone had given way to something darker, a fine-grained stone I couldn't identify, black with a faint blue iridescence when my headlamp hit it at an angle. The breathing was stronger. I could feel it in my teeth. The air pressure on the exhale phase was enough to make my ears pop, and on the inhale phase, I felt myself pull pulled gently forward, a physical tug toward whatever was below. 300 feet past the polished chamber, roughly 900 feet total, from the basement I found, the second room with human evidence. It wasn't handprints this time, it was clothing. Piles of it, folded, stacked along the walls like an inventory. Coats, shirts, dresses, trousers, shoes arranged in pairs. Decades of clothing, maybe a century's worth. Cotton that had rotted to fiber. Wool that had held its shape. Leather shoes that had hardened into sculpture. All folded with care. All arranged with the precision of someone putting things away because they wouldn't need them where they were going. The implication was clear, and I stood with it and felt it settle into me the way all the implications of this place settled, which was slowly and without resistance. People had come here. They had undressed. They had continued into the dark, and they had not come back for their clothes. I did not undress. I did not continue. I stood in that room of folded clothes and looked at a pair of women's shoes, black leather, maybe 1940s vintage, placed neatly side by side on the stone floor, and I thought about the woman who had taken them off. I thought about her feet on the cold stone. I thought about her walking barefoot into the dark, into the warmth, into whatever was waiting further down, and I thought about whether she was afraid. And I knew with a certainty, I cannot explain that she was not. She had not been afraid. She had been going somewhere she wanted to go. The shoes were not abandoned. They were set down. The way you set down your shoes when you come home. I went back to the polished chamber. I sat in the chair. I turned off the light. The warmth came up and I let it come. And I noticed for the first time that the warmth had a quality to it that I'd been avoiding naming. It was specific. It wasn't the generalized warmth of heated stone. It was the warmth of being near a body, a large body, a living body that was radiating heat, the way all living things radiate heat. And it was directly below me, not deep, not geological distance below, but close enough that if the polished floor were a table, I would say there was something underneath the table, pressed against the underside, waiting for the stone between us to become thin enough. I sat with that knowledge, and I was not afraid. That's when I should have been afraid. April continued. The weather warmed. The forest on the ridges went from grey to pale green. The creek dropped as snowmelt ended, and the sound of the water receded, and the breathing of the cave became the dominant sound in the hollow, audible now even from upstairs, a low tidal rhythm that I stopped noticing the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. I wasn't building anything. I'd stopped taking commissions. I was living on savings that would last maybe no more months. And I couldn't make myself care about that, 'cause the future had become an abstraction, and the present was the cave and the chair and the dark and the warmth and the slow, patient expansion of whatever was happening to me from the inside. I was heavier, measurably. I weighed myself at a truck stop on Route 250, and I'd gained 14 pounds without any change in diet or appearance. My body looked the same. My clothes fit the same. But I was 14 pounds heavier than I'd been in November, and the weight felt dense and central, like it was in my bones, like my skeleton was accruing mass the way a tree accrues rings. People responded to me differently. The woman at the hardware store in Elkins, the cashier at the grocery, a man I spoke to at a gas station in Durban. They moved closer when I talked. They held eye contact longer. Two separate people touched my arm during conversation for no reason I could identify. Casual contact that seemed involuntary, as if their bodies had made a decision their minds hadn't authorized. I was, for the first time in my life, someone people moved toward. I had spent 36 years being someone people were neutral about, furniture in a room, and now I was a woodstove. Now people wanted to be near me, and they didn't know why, and I did know why. And the knowing made me feel something that was adjacent to power and adjacent to grief, because I understood that what they were responding to was not me. It was the cave. It was whatever the cave had put in me, or was putting in me, or was becoming through me, and the warmth felt was not mine. I was the medium. The cave was the message. In mid-April, I called Darlene Frey again. I needed to talk to someone who would understand what I was saying without me having to explain the parts that sounded insane. She answered on the second ring. "You've been going in," she said, not a question. "Yes." "How deep?" 900 feet. "There's a room with clothes." Silence. "Darlene, my aunt told me about the clothes," she said. Her voice had changed, not frightened, careful. She said there were 17 people over the life of the congregation who went past the clothes. She said they went in and they didn't come out. She said the congregation didn't call it dying. They called it going down, like it was a direction, not an ending. She said the cave was the reason they sealed it, not because people were going in against their will, because they were going in voluntarily, eagerly. She said by the 1980s, the remaining members couldn't trust each other not to go. They'd find each other in the basement at night, standing at the wall, not remembering how they'd gotten there. She said they poured the concrete to protect themselves from their own want. "What's down there, Darlene?" My aunt said it was the mountain. She said the mountain is alive, that this particular mountain, this ridge, this piece of the Allegheny, is a living thing the same way a tree is a living thing, or a fungus is a living thing, and the cave is how it breathes. And the people who went down went into it the way food goes into a body. She said it isn't cruel. She said it's the oldest thing she'd ever heard of anyone encountering. And it doesn't think the way we think, but it knows we're here. And it wants us the way the ground wants rain, because we make it more of what it already is. I listened to her breathe. 81 years old, on the phone in her house in Marlinton, telling me her dead aunt's account of a living mountain that eats people gently. "You need to stop going in," she said. "I know," I said, "but you won't." I didn't answer. "The ones who went down," she said, "my aunt said they were the happiest people she ever knew, right up until the day they walked in and didn't walk out. She said they were radiant. She said being near them was like being near something holy. She said that was the problem. She said you can't tell someone to stop being happy. You can't tell someone that the best they've ever felt is the thing that's going to kill them, because they'll choose the feeling. Every time, they'll choose it because nothing else comes close." I thanked her and hung up. I went downstairs. I opened the hatch. I went through the passage, through the vestibule of handprints, past the side chamber where the chair had been, into the polished room that was now my room, and I sat in the chair and turned off the light and felt the warmth rise through the stone and into my bones, and I wept, not from fear, from recognition, because she was right. Nothing else came close. Not the marriage, not the work, not the silence I'd built my life around. The cave wanted me, and I could feel it wanting me, and the wanting felt like being loved by something so much larger than myself that my entire life above ground was revealed as what it had always been, which was a surface, a thin, cold surface stretched over a depth that had been waiting for me. Specifically, personally, the way the ground waits for a specific seed, and the patience of that waiting was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing I had ever encountered. I sat in the dark for 3 hours that night, When I came back up, the sanctuary was moonlit through the tall windows, and I stood in it and felt how thin the floor was, how close the depth was, how little wood and stone stood between the ordinary world and the one below it. The next morning I found mud on the basement floor, not from my boots. The mud was on the other side of the plywood, on the cave side, smeared on the wall around the opening, in a pattern I didn't recognize at first and then did handprints. Fresh handprints in wet clay, pressed into the stone around the opening from the inside, as if something, had been standing on the cave side of the wall, reaching toward the basement, pressing its hands against the stone, the way the hundreds of hands in the vestibule had pressed theirs. But these prints were not human-sized. They were large. Each one was easily 18 inches from wrist to fingertip, with fingers that were too long and a palm that was too wide, and an arrangement of digits that was almost right, but not quite, as if something had been studying hands for a very long time and had made its own version from memory. I stood in the basement looking at those prints, and I understood several things simultaneously. The cave had been breathing toward the church for decades. The congregation had felt it and sealed it. The seal had held for 40 years. I had opened it, and the thing below, the mountain, the living mountain, the vast biological patience beneath 900 feet of stone, was reaching back. Not because I had disturbed it, because I had answered it. Every trip down was a response. Every hour in the chair was a conversation. And the mountain, having been answered after 40 years of silence, was now reaching toward the answer, the way any living thing reaches toward what sustains it. I should have sealed the wall. I should have poured concrete and rebar and sealed it the way the congregation sealed it, and driven away and never come back. That is what the rational version of this story requires. The version where the protagonist is sensible and self-preserving and makes the choice that keeps him alive. Instead, I went in again that evening. I went past the polished chamber. I went past the clothing room. I went further than I'd ever been, into the descending passage, where the black stone with its blue iridescence narrowed and the breathing became a big physical force, and the warmth was no longer below me, but around me, in the walls, in the air, in the stone under my hands, when I touched the walls for balance. At approximately 1,100 feet from the basement, I was guessing now, I'd stopped measuring. The passage opened into a space I cannot adequately describe. My headlamp, which had illuminated every chamber so far with its 400 lumens, was swallowed. The light went out into the space and returned nothing. No walls, no ceiling, no floor beyond the ledge I was standing on. I was at the edge of something so large that my light could not find its boundaries, and the air coming out of it was warm and alive and rhythmic, and it smelled like the inside of a body, not rot, not decay. The warm, mineral, humid smell of the living interior of something vast. I stood on that ledge, and I looked into that darkness, and I felt the mountain look back at me, not with eyes, not with consciousness as I understand consciousness, but with attention, a focused ancient geological attention that settled on me, the way sunlight settles on a surface, completely, evenly, without preference or judgment. It knew I was there. It had known I was there since November. It had been breathing toward me for months, warming the stone beneath my chair, pressing its hands against the wall of my basement, learning the shape of the opening I'd made. And now I was standing at the edge of itself, and it was waiting to see what I would do with the same patience. It had waited 40 years for someone to remove the concrete. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long. My watch had stopped. My headlamp began to dim, which meant the batteries were running out, which meant I'd been underground for hours, which meant time had done that thing again where it folded and compressed, and I lost my grip on it. I went back. I went all the way back to the basement, through the opening, up the stairs, into the sanctuary. It was dawn. I'd gone in at 8 in the evening, and it was now 6 in the morning, and I'd lost 10 hours. I could account for maybe 4 of them. I sat in the sanctuary and watched the sun come through the east windows, and I made a decision. I'm going to tell you, I left. I want that to be true. I want the story to be that I recognized the danger and sealed the cave and drove away and rebuilt my life somewhere else, somewhere flat and limestone free, somewhere the ground is just ground and doesn't breathe and doesn't want anything. Here is what actually happened. I called Darlene Frey one more time. She didn't answer. I called again the next day. Her daughter answered and told me Darlene had died the previous night in her sleep. Peacefully, the daughter said, but I heard something in her voice that made me think peacefully was a word she was choosing rather than a word that was accurate. I drove to Marlinton for the funeral. It was small. 12 people in a funeral home that smelled like carpet cleaner and lilies. I stood in the back and I could feel every person in the room orient toward me, the way plants orient toward light, not looking at me, turning toward me. Their bodies shifting in their seats as if I were generating a gravity that pulled at them below the level of conscious awareness. A woman in front of me leaned back until her shoulders were almost touching my chest. She didn't seem to notice she was doing it. After the service, Darlene's daughter approached me. She was mid-50s, grey-haired, direct. "You're the one who bought the church," she said. "Yes." She called me the night after you two last spoke. She told me you were too far in. She said you'd gone past the clothes and you were still walking, and that meant it was too late for telling you to stop. She said the ones who go past the clothes don't stop. She said the mountain has them by then, and what they feel isn't them anymore. It's the mountain feeling through them. I didn't argue with her. I didn't argue because I didn't know if she was wrong. She wanted me to give you something, the daughter said. She reached into her purse and handed me a folded piece of paper. Old, yellowed. The fold lines were dark and soft from decades of being opened and closed. I unfolded it, and it was a hand-drawn map. Pencil on paper, crude but detailed, showing the cave from the church basement to the large chamber at the end. Each room was labeled in a cramped, precise handwriting. The vestibule was labeled the door. The polished chamber was labeled the seat. The clothing room was labeled the leaving. The large dark space at the end was labeled, in letters larger than the others, the mouth. Below the map, in the same handwriting, was a single sentence. "It does not eat you, you become it." I drove back to the church. I sat in the sanctuary with the map in my hands, and I read that sentence until the sun went down. Then I read it in the dark. Then I folded the map and put it on my workbench and went downstairs and through the opening and into the cave. I am writing this from the polished chamber. I brought a notebook and a pen because I know that whatever I'm going to do next, someone should know what's here and what happened and why the man who bought the church on Twist Run Road eventually stopped appearing at the hardware store in Elkins. I am going to leave this notebook in the vestibule, near the handprints, where someone will find it before they go deep enough for the finding to not matter. It is warm here. The chair is comfortable. The dark is absolute. And the breathing is slow and patient. And my own breathing has matched it so completely that I can no longer tell which rhythm is mine. The warmth from below has been rising for hours, and it is now the temperature of a body, exactly the temperature of a body, pressed against the underside of the stone, like a hand pressed against the other side of a door. I am not afraid. That is the truest thing I can tell you, and the most important thing I can tell you, and the thing that should scare you most. I am not afraid. I am the happiest I have ever been. I am sitting in a chair in the dark 900 feet inside a mountain that is alive, and I am happy, and I want to keep going deeper. And I am going to keep going deeper because the only thing on the other side of that decision is a life I have already proven I cannot make bearable. The map says the mouth. Darlene's aunt said the mountain wants us the way the ground wants rain. The note says you become it. I think about the handprints in the vestibule, all those hands pressing into stone, saying, I was here, I was here. I touched this on my way down. And I think they weren't saying goodbye. They were signing in. I'm going to leave the chair here. Someone else might need it. I'm going to fold my clothes in the room where the others folded theirs, and I'm going to place my shoes side by side on the stone floor, and I'm going to walk barefoot into the dark where the air is warm and the mountain is breathing, and the space is so large that light cannot find its walls. If you find this notebook, you already know too much about this place to leave easily. I'm sorry about that. The knowing is the first thing it gives you. And by the time you understand what the knowing costs, the cost feels like a gift. Don't sit in the chair. Don't turn off your light. Don't let your breathing match the rhythm of the air. And if you feel warmth rising through the stone, if you feel that specific, intimate, body temperature warmth that doesn't belong to you, leave. Leave and seal the wall and pour concrete and rebar and never come back. You won't though. I know you won't because I didn't, and the mountain is patient and the warmth is real. And nothing up there feels like this. Nothing up there has ever felt like this.